verse 13 to 16, Paul addresses the whole thing that the people in Galatia turned their back on him. And he actually then refers to the time before they turned their back on him as a blessed time, a time when it was going well, a time where they were not actually afraid of persecution, where they were willing to be persecuted for the gospel. Now he comes and he says, what is causing this change in you? And he comes to the conclusion is, it's simply bad influence, and that is all it is. Let us read Galatians 4 verse 13 to 16. It says, you know that how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first. And my temptation which was in my flesh you despised not, nor rejected, but received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. Where is then the blessedness you spoke of? For I bear you record that, if it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and have given them to me. Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Now, this is a very powerful passage because he is saying things here that we in the church need clarification for. But he's communicating something to the Galatians which was common to them, which they clearly understood. He says in verse 13 that you know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at first. Now what is he talking about here? He says in verse 14, and my temptation which was in my flesh you despised not, nor rejected, but received me as an angel of God. Now the context here, if we're going to read the next verse, which we will still get to, it talks about these Judaizers that came to them. And now he says that he had infirmity in his flesh. If you go and study this out, you will see that Paul was, when he came to Galatia, and this is the assumption here, is that he was beaten up by people. He was beaten in his flesh. He came with stripes and marks and all those kind of things. And the temptation that there was in his flesh, or the temptation, or I would also say the persecution that there was in his flesh, they didn't despise him. They said, well, it looks as if his own people is beating him. His own flesh, his own kind is against him, and we can see in his body that he is suffering. And they weren't ashamed. They accepted him. They weren't under a thing of, well, if his own people doesn't want him, then we must be careful for him. You must realize if somebody comes and he's always in jail, he's always beaten up, he's hated by many people, and he comes to your town, the people would be ashamed of him. They would say, well, we can see you a troublemaker. We can see all the marks in your body and how you've been beaten, all those kind of things. But they weren't ashamed of that. And I think Paul is talking about his body that was beaten up because of a revelation that he had. We must remember when Paul was on the way to Damascus, he had scales over his eyes after his encounter with Jesus. And when he was prayed for, then these things like kind of scales fell from his eyes, and then he could see. And to me that was a type and a shadow of, from that day on, he was really seeing what God has for him. He was getting a revelation of the gospel. And he comes and he says to them here that where's this blessedness you spake of, this blessedness of, I'm so blessed that Paul could come here. I'm not ashamed of Paul. Now you must remember the context of the whole from chapter 1 is a lie was told about Paul. The lie was that he was sent with them, he was sent from a certain group, and he doesn't really understand the gospel. And that there's basically correction now coming in. He says, when I came to you at first, you spoke about how blessed this visit was, but now it's not so blessed anymore. Why? Why would this be? It's because you guys are under a bad influence, and that we will see in the next verse. So I want you to go through verse 13 and 14 again. He says, but you know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at first. So infirmity of the flesh, they thought that it was, many think it was sickness in his body. I don't see that. I see as infirmity in the flesh and temptation in the flesh. I see it as the temptation, the difficulty, the hard times that he was going through in connection with Judaism and all of those kind of things. That's what I believe that is pointing to because of what is coming in verse 17 and 18. And he goes on here, he says, where's this blessedness that you spoke of? For I bear you record. I can remember that if it was possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and have given them to me. Some say this was Paul saying, well, he had bad eyesight, therefore they would have given him their eyes and just showing, well, he's suffering in his body. Here Paul comes, and they weren't ashamed because he wasn't having good eyesight. Now that is completely out of context. The context of Galatians 4 here is all the time talking about no power in the flesh. The flesh system doesn't have life, any of those kind of things. It talks about the death that there is should you be under that system. And now he comes and he says, talking in that context, he says, you saw the infirmity in my flesh. How I was not coming, putting boldness towards being a Jew or any of those kind of things at all. And you even saw my persecution in the flesh and how this thorn in the flesh, if you want to call it like that was given unto Paul, which was a messenger of Satan. He says, you could see how I have been harmed already. Now I'm connecting two different things here together, but this is what I believe this is pointing to. You are seeing how that I have been harmed by the messenger of Satan, which would come and preach a different message wherever I would preach the gospel and harm the work of the gospel. So that in my flesh I cannot boast. I don't have many people following me. I don't have many people saying what I'm saying. But in that infirmity of the flesh, I came to you, and yet you've accepted me. You weren't ashamed of me. It would be like me going to a place and saying to them, preaching the gospel, and they were so happy. And then later on somebody comes and somebody says, well, he's just a cast out, you know. Where's the big churches he started? Where's the millions or thousands of followers that follows Bertie Brits? And then you realize there is no one. But in the beginning, when I was just preaching to a small amount of people, didn't have a big thing going, you accepted me. You accepted me. You weren't against me. You were for me. So what is this whole thing all about now that you are against me? That's what Paul is actually saying here. And when it comes to the eyes, I believe what he's saying is, you guys wanted so bad to see what I'm seeing. You guys wanted so bad the revelation that I have, that you were willing, if it was possible, to take your eyes out and put it in my head, that you can see what I'm seeing, that we can be of the same mind, of the same understanding, seeing the very same thing. He says, am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? He says, if you now come to a place where what I am preaching, which I have not changed, I'm preaching it all the time, that you actually now are declared as my enemy. Can you see the sadness of the Apostle Paul here? He's recalling the good times that he had when he preached, how there was excitement around the gospel, and now the churches in Galatia are actually, when they're thinking of Paul, antagonistic towards him. They want to veer away from him because another gospel was preached to him, which was not a gospel, to the point that the Apostle Paul is now actually seen as the enemy of these people, which he is not. Well, that is Galatians 4 verse 13 to 16.